Hello, and welcome to the final lecture in the Geocurrents series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. Today's lecture covers only one election, that of 2024. After the 2022 election that Donald Trump lost, he was seemingly discredited. He had been decisively defeated in the Electoral College and the popular vote, yet he refused to acknowledge it. There, of course, was the January 6th Capitol attack and riot. There were numerous felony criminal charges, including felony convictions. And there was a second impeachment for incitement of insurrection, in which 57 senators voted to convict, including 7 Republicans. That was, however, not enough to convict him. So, as in all other impeachment cases in U.S. history, impeachment occurred, but conviction did not follow. It is important to note, however, that Donald Trump and his supporters argued that the criminal charges and felony convictions against him were politically motivated, or, if you will, trumped up. Biden's term in office was marked by one major legislative accomplishment, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. This was a revision of the Build Back Better proposal that had been central to his campaign. It, however, was rejected by Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, very much a centrist Democrat, and it was renegotiated into the Inflation Reduction Act. This act was aimed at reducing the federal deficit, although that did not exactly happen. It emphasized investment in clean energy production, or low carbon energy production, moving towards a net zero carbon budget. Also entailed provisions to reduce the price of prescription drugs. It ended up being supported by all congressional Democrats and opposed by all voting congressional Republicans. Several of them did not vote on the measure. There was a high level of inflation in 2022. It is important to note that Republicans claimed that the Inflation Reduction Act was one major reason for the inflation surge that occurred. Democrats usually counter that it was a result of the COVID crisis and supply chain bottlenecks and other issues. It's quite possible that both sides have an element of truth. But you can see that U.S. Inflation did peak at this time, which led to a lot of speculation that the midterm election of 2022 would result in a red wave, or in other words, the election of a lot of Republicans into the House and Senate. No red wave occurred. Republicans did gain 9 seats in the House of Representatives, which was enough to give them control, ending the Democrats' trifecta. In the Senate, it was a different story. The Democrats gained 1 seat in Pennsylvania, Fetterman's seat, cementing the Democrats' control over the upper house of the U.S. Congress. As this Wikipedia infographic indicates, the Democrats had 49 seats to the Republicans 49. But again, it's important to remember there are 2 independents, Angus King and Bernie Sanders, who caucus with and generally vote with the Democrats. So that gave the Democrats a 51-seat majority. A couple other things to note here on the map of the House election. You can see Republicans gaining a number of seats in widely scattered parts of the country, from California's San Joaquin Valley, a couple seats in Arizona, some in the Midwest, and a number in the South and the Northeast as well. But it was not, again, a huge gain, and you can see some dark blue areas where the Democrats picked up seats as well. I also note on the map that in Montana, the western part of Montana, that was a new district created after the 2020 census showed that Montana had gained a significant amount of population. And not surprisingly, it went to a Republican. Once a purple state, Montana is very much a red state today. The other thing I should have noted from that previous slide was that abortion issue figured very prominently in the 2022 midterm election. cost Republican seats almost certainly, especially in governorships and a number of different elections. This led, or it's part of something that led Donald Trump himself to downplay abortion in the 2024 election and to stress that, in his view, it is an issue for the states and not for the federal government. As this slide shows, the 2020 midterm elections didn't reflect particularly well on Trump. He was heavily involved in these elections, endorsing a lot of Republican candidates. As this NBC News report shows, for contests that were competitive, in other words, where it was uncertain which side would win, 46 of Trump's candidates won and 33 lost. So it was a mixed record, I suppose we could say. When we come up to the 2024 presidential election and looking at the Republican contest, first, Donald Trump began with a major polling advantage. You can see his polling numbers are in blue at the top, Ron DeSantis in red. You can see at the very beginning, Trump was polling just under 50%, but by May was over 50% and eventually would get up to near 80%. And you can also see DeSantis's numbers dropping. His campaign was not particularly effective. The orange line is Nikki Haley of South Carolina, generally regarded as a more moderate Republican. And she started to pick up numbers towards the end, but fell far short of what was necessary. And so you could see in Republican primary results how Donald Trump simply dominated the field, getting roughly 3/4 of primary voters, and Nikki Haley just under 20%. Ron DeSantis, pretty minimal numbers. Looking at the map, all that Haley took in caucuses and primaries were Vermont and the District of Columbia. On the Democratic side, it was pretty similar. The incumbent, Joe Biden, faced little opposition. That's generally true of incumbents, although in Biden's case, he had a number of headwinds, an economy that had significantly high inflation numbers, although that had moderated, but a lot of people were suffering from economic distress because of the inflation earlier in his term in power. And also he was showing his age and signs of mental impairment, which led a few people to challenge him, but the challenges were not very effective. Dean Phillips of Minnesota got a few delegates, not much. Jason Palmer of Maryland, a couple as well. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who had been on generally what was regarded as the more left side of the Democratic Party, perhaps more appropriately categorized as left populist, largely because of his opposition to big pharma, big agriculture, many aspects of the federal government that he viewed as in league with these large corporations, classical populist stances anyway. He withdrew from the Democratic primary process and ran instead as an independent, and as we all know, would eventually join the Trump team. Kennedy became very bitter about the Democratic Party because he viewed the party establishment as having done everything they could to keep him off the ballot and to marginalize his campaign. Anyway, after it was clear that Donald Trump and Joe Biden would be the nominees of their respective parties, both of them did have a certain problem of having low favorability ratings. This is from quite early here, September of 2022, and these would change to some degree. But going into the election, both candidates had a big problem, and it's fascinating how close the numbers are here in this Fox poll, with Biden 42% favorability and Trump 41%, within the margin of error, certainly. And toward the end of Biden's campaign, his polling numbers were declining again, due heavily to age concerns. As this Politico article notes, the majority of Americans thought at this time that Biden was too old for another term, regardless of his mental impairment. Simply, his age was considered a big issue. And then there was the report by special counsel Robert Hur that described Biden as a well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory, which greatly irritated many Democratic political analysts, but turned out to be essentially true. But anyway, back to this Politico article. 86% of Americans thought that Biden at 81 was too old. And 59% of those surveyed said both Biden and Donald Trump at 77 are too old to hold office. Again, as we all know, Biden withdrew after a very poor debate performance on June 27th. A lot of speculation as to whether he withdrew voluntarily. It was originally reported by many Democrats to be sort of a self-sacrificing, heroic move, although many others have argued that Biden was pressured out by Democratic leaders, Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, and many have been suggested. But the debate was a debacle for Biden. He was incoherent at times, as you could see in the quotation that I have put on this slide. Biden, in withdrawing, endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris, and Harris quickly gained enough delegates to become the nominee, or the presumptive nominee, and eventually the nominee. That led to many charges, both within and outside of the Democratic Party, of an undemocratic process in determining who the candidate would be. Although I think it is important to note that there really was not enough time to do or at least it would have been extremely difficult to have opened up the primary process again, or done what was necessary to get a fully democratic process here. If it had been a fully democratic process, it's unlikely that, or certainly uncertain, if not unlikely, that Kamala Harris would have turned out to be the nominee. As in the 2020 campaign, she had done quite poorly. She was well funded and had a lot of name recognition, but she had to pull out before the first primaries or caucuses because she simply didn't have the support. At any rate, in 2024, sorry for the typo on that slide, Harris tacked to the center, but was dogged by her 2020 positions because in 2020 she campaigned on the left of the spectrum of Democratic candidates. That was quite an unusual move in that her standing previously as an attorney general in California, for example, had not been on the far left of the party by any means, but she did in 2020 take a number of quite left-wing stances. But as is common, as would be expected in the national campaign when she's going against Trump, she tacked to the center. For example, she called for enhanced border security, Trump's signature platform. But most of her positions were left, center-left, essentially. Things like abortion rights, clean energy, expanded child tax credits. She did advocate military support for both Ukraine and Israel, and that support for Israel definitely cost her a lot of votes, particularly in heavily Muslim areas of suburban Detroit. Evidently, her advisors had thought it wouldn't hurt her too much, and it was not the thing that cost her the election, but it was of some significance. But the view had been that the Arab Americans, Muslims, would not support Donald Trump because of his even stronger support for Israel. A lot of those voters simply stayed home and didn't vote. Of course, again, as we all know, there was the two assassination attempts on Trump, one that actually hit him, generating an iconic photo and boosting his standing, and also bringing a number of people on board his campaign, most notably Elon Musk. So there were, as the CNN article shows, a rash of tech billionaires who have pivoted to Trump for a variety of different reasons. Elon Musk would be the most important one, considering his wealth, his technological accomplishments, and the fact that he did not just endorse Trump, but embraced him, campaigned with him, and is now apparently going to be serving in some capacity in his government. Even more surprising, staggering even, was the endorsement of Trump by RFK Jr. And again, as with Musk, not simply an endorsement, but also rallying with him, working closely with him, and has been selected to serve as Trump's head of Health and Human Services. I imagine that a deal was struck. I know that it's certainly been reported that RFK Jr. and Trump were in negotiation for quite a while, and probably a deal was made that Kennedy would get that, at least would be put forward for that cabinet position. So as the U.S. News article notes here, RFK Jr. drops out and endorses Trump, leading politicos confused and supporters upset. It'd be very interesting to know how many RFK Jr. supporters actually voted for Trump. It is notable that Kennedy did not tell his supporters to vote for Trump unless they were in a swing state. He said if they're in a solid blue or red state, they should vote for him. And he did end up getting some 700,000 votes. One of the most bizarre and unexpected photos of the 2024 campaign was this one on board an airline with RFK Jr. sitting down with Trump and Elon Musk, Donald Trump Jr., to eat a McDonald's meal, considering what Kennedy stands for about health and nutrition. That is ironic indeed, and his facial expression is quite telling. It's important to note that other prominent former Democrats endorsed and embraced Donald Trump. Joe Rogan, the top podcaster in the United States, I believe, in the world, did so the day before the election. Tulsi Gabbard, who had been a 2022 contender for the Democratic nomination, who attacked Kamala Harris in a prominent debate from the left, switching and endorsing Trump, and also being put forward for a cabinet position. So I would put Rogan and Gabbard in the left-leaning populist category. Both had been had been Democrats. Joe Rogan strongly endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016. In 2020, I believe he first endorsed Tulsi Gabbard and then Bernie Sanders again. And then for the centrist plutocrats, I don't know if that's the right word, but very wealthy figures who had been donors to the Democratic Party, switching and endorsing Trump. So I have Bill Ackman here and Mark Andreessen. And Mark Andreessen, probably the more important one. Andreessen was one of the co-founders of, co-writers of the first program for web browsers, founder of Mosaic, Netscape, later became what was known as a super angel investor. He is a billionaire, although I think he has less than $2 billion of assets, which puts him several orders of magnitude below Musk, but still a very, very important figure in Silicon Valley. And that photo comes from an interview that Joe Rogan did with Mark Andreessen after the election, but it was an interview that has got a lot of attention. And Andreessen then, partly because of that interview, has gone on to a number of other interviews. This one with Barry Weiss. Barry Weiss, another centrist figure, had been a Democratic member of the New York Times. Laughter was forced out of the Times, with others formed her own news organization, the Free Press, which essentially comes from a centrist position. But Andreessen told both Barry Weiss and Joe Rogan that the thing that really shifted him into the Trump camp was proposed regulations by the federal government over artificial intelligence. As you can see here in this tweet, Andreessen said he attended an absolutely horrifying meeting where Biden's government vowed a complete complete control over AI technology, saying that there would only be 2 or 3 big companies working closely with the government. So there is an odd alliance of right-wing populists who have long been in the Republican Party with business leaders, very wealthy people, very important people in Silicon Valley in the financial sector who are upset with what they see as overriding government control. And it's not just AI, cryptocurrency certainly figures prominently as well. Also important to note, or at least speculate about whether the vice presidential picks hurt or helped Trump and Harris. Initially, it was widely speculated that J.D. Vance, a senator of Ohio, well-known author of Hillbilly Elegy, that his choice hurt Trump because he is himself such a strong right-wing populist, in many ways more a populist than Trump, and that would supposedly really hurt the Republicans in the more centrist part of the electorate. J.D. Vance, however, became a very effective political campaigner. Republican base certainly took to him very quickly, despite a number of misgivings at the beginning. And I'd also like to note that J.D. Vance, although very much a populist, was part of the economic establishment, having gone to Yale Law School, having worked in Silicon Valley, had a lot of connections there as well. And then Tim Walz was initially viewed, governor of Minnesota, was initially viewed as someone who could really reach out to working class white people. That did not end up being the case. He was dogged by a number of problems of either overstatements or what Republicans would have called lies about his military service and other issues. Polling again underestimated Trump's support, not as much as in the 2 previous elections, I don't think quite as much. And you could see polls were showing a convergence towards the end, but they did have Harris certainly ahead in the popular vote, which obviously didn't work her way. There's a lot of talk about difficulty in getting accurate polling because of shy or suspicious Trump voters who don't want to talk to pollsters. Pollsters did claim they had adjusted for this both in 2020 and 2024 and still didn't adjust enough, perhaps. So, as we all know, Trump won the popular vote and the Electoral College. The Electoral College fairly handily, but not overwhelmingly. The popular vote by a few million votes, although in the end Trump came just below a majority of the votes cast because there were some secondary candidates. But the last I checked anyway with Wikipedia, 49.9%. And compare that, as I have in the graphic here, with 2020. Trump gained about 3 million votes, but Biden had more like 5-6 million votes fewer than Kamala Harris. A lot of this was simply people not choosing to vote. A lot of Democrats say that's because of voter suppression. That probably happened in a few areas, but not nearly enough to make the difference. And the big drops, anyway, in the Democratic vote were in blue states, so they would not have had that sort of voter suppression that is often talked about. About 2% of the vote went for other candidates, but none of them more than 0.5%. The Green Party had dropped again. As I say, here's Kennedy with his 700,000 votes. Libertarian got less than 0.5%, much less than in many previous elections. There were some close state elections. So the darker the color, the larger the margin here on this map. And you can see large Democratic margins. Just a few states, Vermont, Massachusetts, Maryland, Oregon, California, and Hawaii. In the darkest blue category is a lot more states in that dark red category. But quite a few pastel shades here. And Wisconsin was particularly close. The map is showing it sort of in a neutral color. It seems like it should have been more of a very light pink. But anyway, a margin of less than 1%. The red shift, blue shift map is quite distinctive. You see it's definitely a red shift election, but there are a lot of blue counties here that did shift. But a lot of those are very sparsely populated and very Republican counties in places like the Great Plains or the interior West, where it wouldn't take more than a few votes to shift it in that direction. So in a way, it's a bit misleading. But especially in deep blue metro areas appear red on this map. I mean, look at Chicago, that is striking, or Miami-Dade County, Harris County, where Houston is. We can see a lot of very red. The deep red areas are mostly in blue states, not entirely, and mostly in urban areas. So even a Democratic stronghold like King County in Washington, where Seattle is, or Multnomah County in Oregon, where Portland is, are really quite red on this map. Core areas of the San Francisco Bay Area, Alameda County, Santa Clara County, dark red, as is LA County, Orange County, San Diego County, San Bernardino County, in swing state Arizona, Maricopa County, where Phoenix is, very dark red. As far as the blue counties, there are a scattering of different categories here. It's interesting that most of coastal Washington, which is not the most populous part of the state, but we certainly have blue shifts here. A lot of blue shift counties in Colorado, particularly in the mountainous areas where there's a lot of affluent amenity-seeking residents. The one blue county that's dark blue here is Henry County in Metro Alabama, and I have a separate slide where I'll talk about that. 538 from NBC News had some interesting graphics. I just selected one, noting that all states saw a red shift. Washington, the state of Washington, the least. For a while, it looked like Washington and Colorado would have a blue shift. As later votes came in, it turned out they had red shifts as well, but not by much. The big ones were the biggest in New York, and New Jersey, California, also quite striking here, and Florida. As I've said many times, Florida was the quintessential swing state. It's now firmly in the Republican category, at least for the time being. New York, New Jersey, and California still very much blue states, but they saw big shifts. And it's interesting, the swing states showed actually fairly moderate red shifts. Wisconsin just a little bit red. Michigan a little redder. Pennsylvania not very red either. Nevada and Arizona, which also were swing states in this election, more of a red shift. North Carolina, which was another swing state that stayed with the Republicans, just a little bit of a red shift, not that much. Same with Georgia. Anyway, for the first time since 1932, the Democrats had failed to flip any counties. So the red counties here on the map voted for Trump in 20 and 24, and the blue counties voted for Democrats in 20 and 24. And it's those purple counties that flipped. And you can see quite a few of them in California, and quite a few in southern Texas as well. Now, let's look at Texas. We can really map out changing demographic political patterns, if you will, and drawing attention to the Hispanic population or Latino population. As I will talk about in a few minutes, it was the shift of Latino voters from the Democratic to the Republican parties that really were decisive in this election. But Texas has about 40% Hispanic, about 40% non-Hispanic white, actually slightly more Hispanic than the non-Hispanic white people in the state. This was something that was thought by many political observers as something that would lead Texas into the Democratic camp, turn it blue. That hasn't happened. It's red and has turned redder, and it's largely because of the Hispanic vote. So you can see the Hispanic population South Texas, part of West Texas, sort of overwhelmingly Hispanic background. Many of these areas were Spanish speaking before the United States was a country. Some of the counties in the Panhandle as well, very heavily, and throughout the state, except in some of the rural counties in the Far East, large Hispanic or Latino populations. You could see in the 2020 election, those very heavily Hispanic areas in the South and the West all voted for Barack Obama, as did a number of other counties in major metropolitan areas. And for 2024, I've put call outs here. So I have the cities in a regular font and the counties in italic text. But you can see the county in which Dallas is in remained was Democratic voting in 2008 and 2024, and it hasn't really changed much. You can also see, if you look at Austin, if you look at San Antonio, if you look at Houston, the biggest cities in Texas, they were blue in 2008, they're blue in 2024. But a few other changes. Beaumont County, look in the far east, that's the most heavily black county in Texas. I think it's something like 33% had been blue. It shifted to the red. And we can see some suburban counties. For example, near Houston, Fort Bend County, that's the richest county in Texas. It shifted from red to blue, so from 2008 to 2024. As did Hays County, rapidly growing suburban county near Austin. So the affluent suburban vote in places like Texas has tended to move from the Republican to the Democratic camps, but that's been offset by this big movement of Latino voters, and you could just look at South Texas in 2008 and compare it to 2024. There are still a couple of blue counties, but most of them are light red and a couple of them are fairly dark red. And we can see something quite similar in California with the 2020 and 2024 elections. Of course, Democratic candidates won them handily in both cases, but Biden more handily than did Kamala Harris. You can see he got 63.4%. Harris got 58.48%. And Trump's vote went up about 4%. And if you look at the counties, you can see it's mostly interior counties, particularly in the Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley, the southern half of that great valley, and in the far south as well. Area that sometimes called the Inland Empire, which is the eastern fringe of the Los Angeles metro area, in those very large counties of San Bernardino and Riverside in the south. And Imperial County, overwhelmingly Latino in the far southeast, switching from the blue to the red coloration on the map. And then to go to Georgia. Was considered a crucial swing state. Biden won it just barely in 2020 and 2024. Trump did better and won by a few percentage points, pretty similar to the national vote here. You can see suburban Atlanta, though, very large area, though. Atlanta and its suburbs and into its exurbs, blue on both maps. And the one county that really shifted substantially in the Democratic direction was Henry County, as I mentioned before. And you could see here in the graphic in the middle how it was in 2012 Republican voting and then increasingly Democratic voting. And it's clear what's happening here. It's a rapidly growing county, and there's been a lot of immigration of black people, middle class, lower middle class, and upper middle class blacks as well, into this rapidly growing county. Atlanta has become sort of a magnet for black migration now from other parts of Georgia, from other parts of the South, from the North as well. Atlanta has quite a thriving black middle class. And it is still very heavily Democratic voting. There has been a shift in the black population towards the Republicans, but not nearly as much as the Hispanic shift, and it's still overwhelmingly Democratic voting. What I want to do now is go through some of the demographic data. This is from the Wikipedia, so it shows different groups and their vote in 2024 for Trump or Harris. It gives a percentage of the total vote. I won't pay any attention to that. But you can see that what I've done is to add in red numbers there. I'm sorry, Trump's, just Trump, not Harris's, but Trump's vote share change from 20 to 24. And they're all positive unless I have a negative sign before it. So you can see that that there was quite a gender imbalance, as there has been for elections for quite some time. So women voted 53% for Harris. And I should say this is according to exit polling. Take it with a grain of salt. It is by no means completely accurate, but it's suggestive and it's important, and it's what we have to work with. Where men voted for Donald Trump by 55%. But both of those groups, men and women, saw an increase in their vote share from 2020 to 2024. Marital status is a big predictor as well. The married tend to vote Republican these days. That didn't used to be true, but it is now. And the unmarried tend to vote Democratic, although it's not overwhelming by any means. But Trump picked up 3 percentage points with married and 2 percentage points with the unmarried, which he lost, but not by as large a margin as he had before. And you can combine the two to get gender by marital status. Trump increased his support of married men from 55 up to 60%, so pretty substantial. Married women were one group that did not change in their percentage who voted for Trump. White vote for Trump, you can see white vote strongly pro-Trump, 57% to 41%, but there was actually a slight decline by 1%. White vote had been 58% for Trump in 2020. Black vote went up for Trump, but only by 1 point, not by nearly as much as some Republicans were anticipating. It had gone up. The black vote had increased for Trump more in 2020 versus 2016, if I remember that correctly. It's the Latino or Hispanic population where you see this big shift. It was still pro-Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, 52% to 46% for Trump, but that was a 13% Trump gain from 2020. Asian population, a smaller percentage of Trump voters, only 39%, but that was an increase of 3. And I put a question mark in the Native American or American Indian vote because this is really an astounding figure, and there's some doubts about it. And it was not included in the information for the 2020 election, so I don't have a red number there, just a red question mark. But as I say, this is astounding if true. 65% of American Indians, who are usually noted as a strong Democratic voting contingent. So I'll talk about that later on and actually bring up some maps because it is significant. Continuing with this, white men, overwhelming Trump supporters, 60%, but a 1% drop, and white women, a 2% drop. Black men, 2% increase in the Trump vote, only 21%, so not huge by any means. But it has a second time that's gone up. It had gone up significantly in the 2020 versus the 2016 election. Black women actually dropping a bit. But Latino men, look at that, 55% for Trump, a 19 percentage point increase. That's astounding. Latino women, very different situation, 38% for Trump, but an 8% increase. Religion, a big increase in support of Catholics for Trump, 58%. That's 11 points, and a lot of that are Hispanic Catholics, which is probably the majority of Catholics in the United States now. I'm not certain about that. No religious affiliation, the secular population, overwhelmingly for Harris, and increasingly so, 5% drop in Trump support. So all of these things sort of go together, and I'll try to tie it all together at the end of the lecture. So just continuing with a few other categories here. We can see white evangelical or born-again support overwhelmingly for Trump. Remember, when Trump first ran, he was concerned about this demographic and chose Mike Pence to be his running mate to shore up support there. but evidently no longer needs to do so, and increased his percentage point with this group as well. One of the things that was very surprising to me was the 18 to 24-year-old category. Strongly for Kamala Harris, only 42% for Trump, but note that 11% increase for Trump, the largest of these age categories. Whereas the 30 to 39-year-olds, there was no change, and that category also went for Harris. The categories that went for Trump were middle age categories, and there were increases there as well. 40 to 49-year-olds, 6% up, and other categories here as well. Continue just a few more of these slides. I'll look at the ones by race, and I won't dwell on these because we've heard these issues again and again. But I just note Latino voters from 18 to 29 and from 45 to 64, 19% increase. So that's the big change here. Sexual orientation, LGBT, big decline for Trump, overwhelming support for Harris here. I was surprised to see that the decline was so much, 10%. And I have a hard time understanding exactly why that would be. First-time voters, this was shocking, if true, 24% increase with Trump taking that category. So a lot of this is younger voters. And Trump increasing his tendency to appeal to those with less education, so high school or less. Trump took that category overwhelmingly with 63% of the vote and a 9% increase. Where those with a bachelor's degree went quite heavily to Harris, not as heavily, but decisively, and Trump actually lost 2 percentage points in this category. Very similar, white college graduates strongly for Harris and a 3% decline for Trump versus 2020. Whereas white, no college degree overwhelmingly, white, no college degree increase for Donald Trump. Non-white, no college degree. Yes, that makes sense. And I think the second to last of these graphs, looking at women, white women with college degrees, overwhelmingly for Harris and a decline for Trump. In terms of income category, we see this very important inversion of what had been the norm of low-income people voting for Democratic candidates. That is the historical norm for quite some time, whereas now more in the Trump camp. For the poorest, under 30,000, Harris did win 50 to 46, pretty close, and no change in the Trump vote. But for the sort of lower middle class, getting into the core of the middle class, income categories of 30 to 100,000, we have Trump winning and having a huge gain, 9% over 2020. Whereas upper middle class and into the upper income ranks, we see a decline in the Trump vote, 100 to 200,000, a 10% drop, very substantial, and Harris winning that by pretty narrow margins. I think the last issue here I will look at here would be what they have area type, which means population density, essentially. With Harris winning the urban vote, as would be expected, but no change. That's sort of surprising because a lot of big cities saw a big drop, but urban here includes suburbs as well. No, I'm sorry. There's a separate suburban category, but urban includes a lot of smaller cities. So it's a bit hard to understand. Anyway, the suburban vote, this is in one place where the election was really fought out, where Trump won by not by a huge margin, but had substantially increased his suburban vote by 3%. And it's the rural areas where Trump has his greatest support, and the Democrats in general, and a 7% increase there. So I do want to take on the issue of the Native American or American Indian vote shift. Uh, I could not. The Wikipedia has these charts of demographic categories in their voting behavior, but they added Native American or American Indian for the first time in 2024. But in Wikipedia articles, one of them anyway claimed that a survey by Indian Country Today found 68% of American Indians and Alaska Natives supporting Joe Biden. So if that was really true, if both of those are true, then this was just a monumental change in voting behavior of this demographic category. But there's a lot of reason to doubt it. Here's a Native American Rights Fund article casting doubts on this exit polling. There were few, it was a very small sample size. It did not adequately represent Native Americans living on reservations. That's something we can see very clearly in the county level data. We cannot see Native Americans living in urban areas to the same way. There does seem to be a tendency, though, for Indigenous peoples living on reservations to vote more heavily for the Democratic Party than those in off the reservations. And this partly has to do with government support for reservations and the American Indian nations that live there. One way we can try to do this is look at a map of American Indian population by county and then compare that to the 2024 election. And if you look at a lot of those counties with very high levels of American Indians in northern Arizona, New Mexico, for example, and parts of South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, you can see in general they're blue counties. On the other hand, you could see Oklahoma, which doesn't have many reservations at all, but does have a very large American Indian population. You can't see any connection. In fact, a lot of those fairly heavily Native American counties there are quite red on the map. Now, none of them are American Indian majority, so it becomes a little trickier. Or actually in Alaska, you could see that some correlation of Indigenous majority with Democratic voting patterns, but it's not perfect by any means. And it is clear that there has been a shift, though it's unclear as to whether the shift is as great as some of the information suggests. One way to do this is to look at Montana. There are 4 counties with Indigenous majorities here. I have the percentages here. Glacier, Blaine, Roosevelt, and Bighorn. You can see in 2012, all of those counties are blue. Glacier and Bighorn really quite dark blue, those with the largest percentage, Blackfeet and Glacier, Crow and Bighorn. But then you can see in 2020, one of those counties, Roosevelt, turning pink. And then in 2024, all of them except Glacier with the Blackfeet Nation, which remained fairly dark blue, although not as dark as before. Bighorn County turning pink. So there definitely has been some shift here. It's one thing to look at the change from 2020 to 2024. It is maybe a bit more revealing to go back to look at the change from 2012 before Trump was a candidate to 2024 and look at some of the shifts. So Nate Silver of the Silver Bulletin has done this. It's some surprising. You can see the black vote with a net shift 19% to the Republican Party, but that's just because the black vote was so overwhelmingly for the Democrats in 2012, 91-4. The Hispanic vote, though, a bigger shift, Republican direction of 29%, Asian 17%, quite substantial. Others, that would be a lot of that would be Native American, 17% as well. But all these other categories here, whites with no degree, imperfect proxy for income levels, a big shift in the Republican direction, although not as much as a Hispanic shift. Non-white with a BA, a bigger shift, and non-white with no degree, a bigger shift yet. So again, a lot of that is the Latino or Hispanic vote. And age category with the youngest group, 18 to 24, showing a pretty substantial shift in the Republican direction. The last few slides I want to show is just some speculations about why the Democrats lost this election. And here I'm looking mostly at Democratic sources, and I've read many of them, so many I've sort of lost count, so I don't want to get into the weeds here, but just in general terms here. And I have this in sort of two categories. So one would be factors external to the party. So a lot of Democratic pundits and opinion leaders claim that economic concerns were crucial here, mostly inflation, and that they would argue it was mostly caused by COVID, although many others say it was caused by the spending of the Democratic Party. Most Republicans would argue that way. Democrats who claim that the issues are external to the party also note that there's hostility to incumbents across the globe. It doesn't really matter what party they're in. And a lot of that has to do with the fallout from the COVID period, inflation, and so on. A lot of Democrats emphasize political misinformation, and there certainly is a lot of political information. I don't think anyone can really doubt that. And would also argue that it should be reined in. And then there are those, and I've talked to plenty of people who say this is the issue is simply that the American public is racist, sexist, and transphobic, and not much that can be done about that. Other Democrats turn to factors internal to their party, arguing that there were poor candidates, both at the presidential and vice presidential levels, who are not particularly effective campaigners, were not able to articulate their messages well, and that there was an inadequately democratic nomination process that some would argue goes all the way back to 2016. Some Democrats argue that the party has gone much too far to the left on social and cultural issues, especially those connected with sexuality, that it's too radical. But then there are Democratic populists who say the party has gone too far to the right on economic issues. They've been doing that since Bill Clinton in this viewpoint, and it's too establishmentarian. There are firm liberals in the Democratic Party. Bari Weiss would be a good example, who claim that the party has turned away from key liberal principles, especially free speech, meaning that they're doing too much to restrict information on the basis of possible disinformation. And there are also plenty of left-wing Democrats who claim the party has become much too friendly with the deep state, the FBI, CIA, and the so-called military-industrial complex. I mean, this is the sort of thing that led someone like Tulsi Gabbard to leave the Democratic Party and become a Trump supporter. I am very intrigued by Rui Teixeira and John Judas for their transition in thinking. I must say I greatly respect people who change their minds on the basis of new information. And boy, have Teixeira and Judas have done this. Because in 2002, they wrote this very influential book called The Emerging Democratic Majority, which is essentially the demography is destiny thesis that the Hispanic Latino population of the United States was increasing rapidly, would continue to increase. Most Latinos are Democratic voters, and so the Democratic Party could look forward to a long-standing majority status. But they had really changed their minds in the Trump era. They wrote a book in 2023 called Where Have All the Democrats Gone? And they basically argued that both by taking far left social and cultural positions and center or even center-right economic positions, becoming very friendly with Wall Street and large corporations and Silicon Valley and so on, that the Democrats have lost the working class, that they thought they could focus on affluent professionals, again, going back to the days of Bill Clinton, who tend to be more economically centrist or center-right, but tend to be, centrist, I would say, but tend to be more left-wing on social and cultural issues. So the Liberal Patriot is a Substack associated with Rui Teixeira. A lot of other people write on it as well, but they came straight out and said, how Latinos elected Trump, and it's pretty hard to avoid this from that exit polling data that I've given you. So to quote this, according to Pew, around 79% of Hispanics lack college degrees. Unsurprisingly, it is a group that has seen itself drawn to both the populist, right populist Donald Trump and the left populist Bernie Sanders. So there's this odd right-left populist convergence. And in the Liberal Patriot, again, they have a number of graphics that would indicate that the working class is losing faith in the Democratic Party. Working class people increasingly seeing it as incompetent or out of touch or unpatriotic or weak or untrustworthy. Or other ones looking at how over the last 80 years voters associate the Democrats more with sociocultural issues than with class and economic solidarity. And the percentage claiming that Democrats, they support the Democrats because they represent the working class has gone way down, whereas the percentage saying they stand up for marginalized groups has gone way up, as has those who focus on climate issues. And I should have said it before, but it was remarkable how little climate change figured in the 2024 election compared to other elections. This is seen as a weak spot for the Democratic Party in polling because the net zero programs tend to lead to higher energy costs. We've certainly seen that in Europe, Germany, and the UK especially, but also in the United States, with states like California, New York having higher energy costs than other states, which is very much a pocketbook issue. It doesn't hurt affluent voters very much because energy costs are a very small percentage of their budget, but for working class, lower middle class voters, particularly those in rural areas who have to drive a lot because of the long distances involved, energy costs hits really hard. Or again, more evidence to share as thesis, where we could see that we have the median voters position here on affirmative action and on immigration, and then the Republican stance and the Democratic stance. And of course, the median voter is in between the two, but we could see after 2012 the Democratic Party really shifting away from the median voter on affirmative action and on immigration. Or finally, the last graphic here, the Democrats fared better with the richest Americans than the poorest, and this is by thirds for the first time in decades, so that is significant. So I just want to end with a few sort of speculations. Are we in a period of party transformation? So many of us are saying, well, the Republicans are becoming the multiracial party of the working class, and the Democrats are becoming the party of the elite. Oh, you can argue that, but I think it's a rather simplistic claim. One thing it's important to understand is both parties have now and have always had to appeal to certain elite segments and certain non-elite segments. If you just appeal to the elites, that's not going to work because they don't have the numbers, but they do have the money, so you do need to appeal to some elite segments. So that's always been true. And today the Republicans are far more favorably disposed towards billionaires or mega billionaires than are Democrats. So the Democrats certainly have not become the elite party in that sense. Republicans today tend to be very opposed to billionaires who support the Democratic Party, but certainly not to those who support them. And another question, are we in a period of party transformation? Well, I think that is true, but another way to look at it is whether the Republicans are becoming a party of radical change, where they really want to change how the U.S. federal government works, and the Democrats much more the party of the status quo. And yeah, I think there's a certain amount of truth there. But is this Republican populist radicalism? Is it what kind of radicalism is it? Is it backward looking, hence reactionary? A lot of Democrats say that the Republicans want to return us to the America of the 1950s with all of its discrimination, which is hardly possible or feasible, but there certainly is some nostalgia for that in the Republican Party. But it's also, one could say that the Republican radicalism is very forward-looking, wanting to open up, do something as extreme as colonize Mars is what Elon Musk wants. One reason why Elon Musk turned to the Republican Party is he sees the regulations as hemming in his abilities to further space exploration and slowing down the economy, which would also hurt his ultimate effort to colonize Mars, as he quite explicitly puts it. Or, of course, it's perhaps both is the best way to look at it, because there are different ways of thinking about progress. So finally, my last slide says both parties can style themselves as progressive. The term is almost always used for the Democrats and not the Republicans, but the Republicans are very much progressive, but in a different sense. Well, especially the tech side of the Republicans. So by progress, Democrats focus on social and environmental equity and on environmental sustainability, whereas Republicans focus on economic growth and technological development. And a lot of Democrats are concerned about unbridled technological development and economic growth because of the environmental consequences that it can have. And another way to look at it is the Democrats had, since the Obama era, really turned towards DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, whereas the Republicans, well, certainly under certainly Elon Musk and those influenced by him, thoroughly reject that DEI, which is aimed at socioeconomic progress as Democrats see it, and in turn advocates what he calls MEI, merit, excellence, and intelligence, return to the idea of a meritocracy and reward excellence and intelligence, which may well exacerbate socioeconomic divides, probably will, but according to Musk, will unleash economic forces that will create more economic prosperity and let us continue the march of technological progress, which, to reiterate, certainly the green side of the Democratic Party believes would lead to environmental ruination. So we are very definitely a divided nation right now politically. I just read somewhere where polarization was put forward by one dictionary as the word of the year. And I think that's an appropriate word, because polarization is extremely strong in this country, but it is a complicated form of polarization, which is what I have wanted to get across in this lecture and more generally in the class as a whole. So thank you for tuning into these lectures. The next Geocurrents lecture series will be on global demography. I will be teaching a course in the Stanford Continuing Studies program. I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like Population Explosion or Birth Dearth, Controversy Surrounding Global Demography. Very interesting case where both sides agree with the data. Human population is increasing, but the birth rates are plummeting over most of the world. But the two sides really disagree with the implications of these changes and what should be done about it. So, as always in my classes, I will try to remain relatively neutral, or at least as neutral as I can. And after I deliver those lectures to Stanford Continuing Studies program, I will re-record them and put them up on the Geocurrents YouTube site. Thank you very much. The end.